Welcome. Welcome back. Glad to see all your smiling faces with us today. And I have heard through the grapevine that we've got some new watchers. And there they are. We are glad to have everyone today as we have another installment of Crack Open the Book. And today we are going to continue on with our examination of one of the most important issues that's raised in the scriptures. And we're using the book of Job as the background for that. So let's get right to it. We are familiar with the book of Job. Many people recognize that name, whether they're religious or not. And he's recognized as a man of patience. And the scriptures tell us that you have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. We chose a translation that used the word perseverance. After examining last time some of the details concerning the meaning of the word, we agreed that this is probably a better rendering than just patience. There's an element of endurance and steadfastness in this word, and so we chose the New American Standard Translation along with the ESV that kind of put it together with perseverance. So we're using this text to highlight this idea. But what was it actually that Job went through? And so we looked, as it were, at the theological question. Here's Job. If God is all-powerful, and he's loving or good, then why did this happen to him? If you've read the book, and you should have read a lot of the introductory section already by now, you'll know that Job's going to, really feel the pressure on several fronts. And so oftentimes this question of suffering comes up, and we're going to take this one head on as we began it last week, trying to answer the question, why do bad things happen to good people? So here's our class. Glad to see you, class. All of you are on time today. We're glad to have you. We're dealing with the issue of suffering as seen in the book of Job. And so there they are, and we're ready to get to it. Because we know that the issue of suffering, its distribution and degree appear to be entirely random and therefore unfair. Many people are puzzled by the issue of suffering and oftentimes even blame God or just throw God out of the picture altogether. That if there really was a God, he wouldn't let this suffering stuff happen. So yes, Irene. Irene says, why does suffering happen? She asked that question last time. And so everybody, what did you move the chairs for? Okay, William, what do you think? What then is the reason for suffering? That's the real question that Irene and others are asking. What then is the reason? What is a reason? What is the reason? Oh yeah, William, wrong choices. That's what we covered last time. Wrong choices are the source of suffering. Even to the, what? Is that the only reason? Well, Irene, actually yes. Yes, all the suffering in the world can be accounted for because of a single choice. Now, William reminded us that wrong choices create, but really, if you examine the biblical picture, it all comes down to a single choice, at least the reason why or how suffering came to be. So, yes, oh, thank you. Henry, the garden. Yes, the garden is where it all began, Henry. And that, what do you mean, Marilyn? The garden. You forget the information we covered. Okay, let's go back and check out what Henry has reminded us of. Dealing with the issue of suffering. Marilyn, you just come up there and sit down in the front and we'll go over this with you. All right? Okay. This is how suffering came to be. Okay? All right. First of all, man was put in the garden and everything was accessible to him. But there was one tree in particular that God said that they shouldn't eat from, lest they die. That was the terms. That was the deal. Then the serpent came along and he said, you will not die. Well, there's quite a distinction between these two positions. And so man was put into a situation where he had to choose. He had to make a choice. Was he going to die from eating the tree and God was in charge? Or did the serpent really know what was going on and you really wouldn't die? That's the choice he had to make. Now, you know what happened. Through one man, the writer in Romans says, sin entered to the world because he chose to eat, along with Eve, of course, but he chose to eat. And so sin entered. And the Bible says that death then, through sin, and death certainly is the ultimate form of suffering. Wouldn't you agree? So death entered into the world as a result of sin. And that suffering has been with us ever since. And you say, well, that might be fine for Adam and for Eve and stuff, but what about us? Well, remember, death spread to all men because all sinned. Everybody sinned. It's true that the sin of Adam let sin, bring in death. But we're not exempt. We've all sinned, and therefore death spread to all, suffering spread to all men, Marilyn, because of that one choice. Let's make sure we understand that clearly. Through one man, sin got into the world. But everybody sinned. So whether it was him or you or me, doesn't matter. Sin would have still got in, and suffering is a result of sin. All right, let's take a look at it this way. The question that's raised by people oftentimes is, if God is all-powerful and if he's all-loving, then why does he allow suffering? Now, that's a different question. We just covered how suffering came into the world. The question here is, why does God allow it if he's all-powerful and all-loving? There's fundamentally two groups of people that ask this question. One, there is the skeptic, or the one who is trying to throw doubt on the existence of God. And so they raise this question primarily to somewhat muddy the water, to cause a certain level of confusion. And then there is the person that I hope is watching this video, or anybody who's watching this video. The idea is, do you really want to know what the answer is? So, why does he allow suffering? If he's all-powerful and he's all-loving, then the atheist, the skeptic would say, well, he's obviously not all-powerful because there is suffering. Even though he may be loving, he's not powerful enough to stop it. Or, if he is all-powerful and he doesn't stop it, then he obviously doesn't care. Well, that's the way they put it. But let's step back. The question is flawed. The question is flawed. Henry, Henry, you're up in the front. Henry, do you have a question? What's the deal? Example. You want some examples? Okay. All right, Henry, let's try this. If fire will consume what it burns, fire does do that, right? All right, Henry. If fire will consume what is burned, if the building was on fire, why wasn't the building consumed? You see the parallel here? If fire will consume what it burns, and that's true, if the building was on fire, then what should have happened? Well, the reason the question is flawed is the same reason that this question is flawed, or the situation is flawed. And that's because there can be more components that we're unaware of involved in the process that may explain the situation. So let's take the building, for instance. The building didn't burn down. Why? Because it had a sprinkler system. Nobody mentioned that in the equation. It had a sprinkler system, Henry. So even though it's true that fire will consume what it burns, and if a building is on fire, it will burn to the ground, but in this case the building didn't. And why is that? Because it has a sprinkler system, something that we didn't mention in the question. The same is true for the above question that we started with. God is not just powerful and loving. He's also just and merciful. When you throw those into the equation, then we have a better opportunity of truly understanding the nature of suffering. So why does he not stop suffering? Well, you see there, we have the process of suffering. And we recognize that he is loving and he is all-powerful, but he's just or fair. He did not make us robots. We talked about that last time. He gave us what? Choice. He gave us choice. So you mean to tell me that he doesn't stop suffering because he gave us choice? Yes, it's directly connected. God demonstrated his own love towards us in that while we were yet still sinners, that is, while we made the wrong choice, Christ died for us. I want you to focus here on the concept of love towards us. Why did Jesus have to go to the cross and die? We're asking the question, we say, why doesn't he stop the suffering of ourselves? The real question, the bigger question is, if he knew this is where it was going to go, why didn't he just stop it at the beginning? Because what it was going to cost him would be his son in a very painful death of which he never deserved in any stretch of the imagination. And not only did he not deserve it, he knew we did deserve it, yet he still went and died on our behalf in this very painful way. Yes, William. So what's the bottom line? You're always straight to the point. We thank you. The bottom line is simply this. If there is no suffering, there can be no love. It is not possible to comprehend love without suffering. There's no point of reference. It's like trying to perceive up without a down, left without a right, hot without a cold. They are not in any way able to be separated from each other if we expect to comprehend them. God didn't cause the suffering. Man chose. But through that choice and that suffering, God then was able to exhibit the ultimate in his plan, which was the demonstration of love to all his people. And the hope was that men would recognize that and in turn love God back with the same kind of due diligence as well as loving each other. So, in this arena of including all of these aspects, let's put this to the test. What if we don't have suffering? Let's just take it away. There's no suffering, there's no pain, there's no trouble of any kind. Then what would we be? We'd be robots. Instead, we had the opportunity to do this. Happy, joy, family, all of the things that are associated with it. Suffering, however, is the mechanism or the result or the connection of how we get to that point. And God knows every tear that has ever fallen. He knows it. But he knows the pain more than any of us by watching his son die on the cross that he didn't deserve it. Not just the death on the cross, but the misuse, the mistrust, the abuse that he took, not just on the cross, but the whole 3.5 years of his life. The skeptics and the scorners and the isolation and all of that, none of which he deserved. God knew it, and yet he allowed the suffering of his son continue because he knows that if it doesn't, there is no hope for man. And that man could not see the love of God demonstrated on that cross. And without that picture, we have no way of knowing what it really means to love. So, in the end, God goes one step further and explains to us that he will wipe away every tear from their eye. There will be no more pain. There will be no more suffering. He is going to make every wrong right. But you can't have a right without a wrong. Suffering is necessary to understanding love. Again, God did not make suffering. He gave man choice. And so in our original proposition, all the suffering in the world can indeed be traced back to that single choice Henry, you're going to vote for that side. You don't want to be a robot. Anybody? Oh, there goes William. He doesn't want to be a robot either. How about, oh, there's 3. Marilyn, yep, there you are. Neither do I. I don't want to be a robot. I understand that on this side there's suffering, but I understand on this side there are the things that I've experienced and that you've experienced, the joys and the pleasures, and they erase the suffering. And some of us have had horrific suffering, and there's still probably more suffering to come in our lifetimes, but there is an expectation of some of the best times yet to come because of what Jesus did on the cross. Well, what about Job? He was a blameless man. How does this fit into that? Excellent. We know we're asking that in the back of our mind too. Job offered burnt offerings for his children, and more than likely for himself as well. And why would that have been? He understood the principle we just talked about. Bad choices create suffering. So, in order to have forgiveness for those sins, we already looked at the fact there must be the shedding of blood and thus sacrifice. So Job sacrificed to the standards of God's instructions and thereby making things right again. However, but what, Irene? Let me guess what you're thinking. If Job was blameless, why did he suffer? How am I doing? I get the part about if we make a bad choice we suffer, but what about Job? He was blameless, and he still, as you know, suffered greatly. Well, Job even asked the very same question. Job said, teach me. He's talking to the men that came to support him initially, but they've concluded the same thing that maybe you and I have concluded, that Job has done something wrong, and that's why he's suffering. And so Job says to his other guys, he says, teach me and I will hold my tongue. Cause me to understand where I have erred or made the mistake or sinned. You tell me. And as you've read through this story, if you've read through it all, you know that none of them could point to a single thing that they knew that Job had done that would cause this suffering, but they still conclude, because they think this is the only answer to it. He must have done something wrong. There can't be any, you can't do everything right or do something right and get punished for it. Well, let's take a closer look. If Job was blameless, why did he suffer? There's the process. We know when you make bad choices, you have the potential to suffer. Let's not confuse something right here. Let's not confuse blamelessness with sinlessness. Blameless means you fixed it. Okay? You took care of the problem. And in Job's case, sacrifice. Or Abel's case, sacrifice. Or you pick somebody. Job offered burnt offerings. Okay? He wasn't sinless, he was blameless. So, Irene, what can we do for you? So are you saying Job's suffering because of past sins? Well, that's a good observation on your part, Irene, but no, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that at all. If he offered sacrifice, then those sins were forgiven. That's for sure. God doesn't do some kind of, bring it back program. So we still haven't answered the question. If Job was blameless, why did he suffer? Well, let's deal with it. There's another player in this game that we haven't mentioned. His name is Satan, the serpent, the devil of old. He's in this game. He's the enemy. Let's look at it and recognize he was there in the beginning. He's part of this whole suffering business. It's through his temptation that we have Adam and Eve make that very, very sinful choice. But God didn't cause it. He allowed the enemy, as a part of the choice process, to make his proposition. Consider it this way. In the garden, everything's great. You can see it right through the opening there. Green grass, green trees, blue skies. But there was a tree called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they were instructed not to eat from it. And what did the serpent say? What did the devil of old, Satan, say? What did he say? Go ahead. You won't die. Instead, by golly, you'll be like God himself. And that must have been the pitch line that sold at him. He wanted to be, don't we buy into that? Don't we say, I want to be God. I want to be my own man. I want to be in charge of myself. It sounds good. Let's take it. And Adam took it. And guess what happened? Sin and suffering came right through the door. Death entered into our world. That door opened. And we were kicked out of the garden. We were kicked out of paradise. We were kicked out of the presence of God. And we were followed in by sin and suffering. And remember in Genesis 3:15, this proclamation was made. And I will put enmity between you and the woman. Enmity is struggle or conflict. The serpent is our enemy. The devil is our enemy. And we have conflict with him. So Satan can cause suffering? You bet, Irene. He sure can. He sure can. Does Job know that? Now that's even a better question. But no. If you've read the text, and we're going to pursue it in the coming days, if you've read the text, you know that Job doesn't know that fact. But we know it. So some suffering, as it was, comes from different angles. But God has a plan and a purpose. The suffering on the cross by his Son was intended for good. Suffering has a role to play because of the choice that Adam made. So, next time, we're going to continue our examination, tie up a couple of little loose ends possibly with the issue of suffering, and then we're going to get right into the text of Job and look at this story now that we know the devil's involved here too. So I hope this has been helpful for you, and I am so glad that you took some time out to spend with us. So, as always, may God bless you, and you be sure that you pass that blessing along to someone else.
This has been a Badger Godbolt production. For more information or to ask a question, please feel free to contact us at crack.open.the.book@gmail.com. You can also visit our YouTube channel, Crack Open the Book, at youtube.com. And don't forget to follow us so you never miss an opportunity to have a conversation about truth.